Hang on.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Conditions and Maintenance of Certification webinar. My name is Anthony. I am the Director of the Division of Certification and Testing in the Office of Technology here at ONC, and I am going to be joined by my colleagues Mike Lipinski, who is the Director of our Division of Federal Policy and Regulatory Affairs, and also Avinash Shanbag, who is the Executive Director of our Office of Technology. Next slide. Okay, just want to let everybody know that we're going to be going through a high-level overview of the conditions of certification and maintenance of certification as both a concept and the individual requirements. This material is based on the final rule that is issued. We have tried to make everything here as accurate as we possibly can, but of course, sometimes there are mistakes that will creep in. This is not a legal document. For legal documents and program requirements, you should refer to the federal rule. Of course, this has been produced and it is made available at taxpayer expense. Next page, next slide. Next slide. Okay, so the concept of the conditions and maintenance of certification was introduced. Congress required this through the 21st Century Cures Act that required health IT developers to adhere to this notion of conditions of certification around specific concepts. And we have coalesced those concepts into these conditions of certification that you will see on the right around information blocking, assurances, communications, APIs, real-world testing, and attestation. There was a future criteria that requires electronic health record reporting criteria. We'll finalize that in future rulemaking. So today we're going to be dealing with these 6 conditions of certification and any maintenance of certification requirements that go along with it. The way that ONC has enacted these is finalizing some initial certification requirements and then these ongoing maintenance requirements. So you will see in each of these conditions of certification that we go through, you will see an initial condition and ongoing maintenance that is applicable to each of these. You will see some concepts within here that touch, I think, on health IT that is applicable to many people, but I want to stress that what we are talking about here in conditions and maintenance of certification is applicable to health IT developers, so developers of certified health IT modules. These are not requirements that are placed upon providers. These are requirements that are placed upon certified health IT developers and their certified health IT modules. And in some cases apply specifically to the health IT developers' business practices relative to the certified health IT that they have. So these are purely applicable to health IT developers in the certification realm. Next slide. Before I go further, I want to mention, and I will mention this several times throughout our presentation in case anybody misses this, yes, this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted and available on our website later so that people can refer back to it. So you do not have to be furiously taking notes here. It will be available for everybody to look at. The first condition of certification is information blocking. Again, this is where I will draw that distinction where the conditions are applicable to health IT developers. There are other provisions within the CURE's final regulation that relate to information blocking and what cannot be done, and those are applicable to other actors that we define. So for example, healthcare providers and health IT developers and health information exchanges and networks. But in this case, what we are talking about as a condition of certification are not those things that you see in the right-hand slide. They are specifically things that are related to health IT developers. And this condition of certification establishes that a health IT developer may not take any actions that constitute information blocking. Again, this is applicable to the health IT developers' business practices in relation to their certified health IT. I'm not going to go deeply into this, but you should be aware that there are a number of exceptions that are made available in this area. For the most part, these are pretty common sense exceptions that are related to things that would allow information blocking in instances that, for example, when doing so might substantially reduce the risk of harm to a patient, or something that would respect an individual's request for privacy. There are things for security, infeasibility, and so forth. We won't go through each of those, but in general, this condition of certification applies to the notion of health IT developer not taking any actions that will constitute information blocking in relation to their certified health IT products. That is the initial condition of certification. It is something that takes effect 6 months from the publication date of the final rule. There isn't a maintenance of certification in the sense of an extra thing for a developer to do beyond ongoing compliance with that particular condition. Next slide. So the second condition of certification is in assurances. Essentially, a developer is providing an assurance that they are conforming to the full scope of certification criteria to which their module is certified. In many ways, this is nothing new. ONC has always expected this as part of the ONC Health IT certification program. This does add several of the new cures requirements. So you will see you're providing an assurance that you didn't do things related to information blocking. You are making the full capabilities of the certification criteria available to the customers and end users, and aren't taking any actions to interfere with that. You are disclosing and attesting whether you are storing any clinical information, and then there is a portion of this assurances that relates to this notion of certification to what we call the B10 criteria. So I'm going to go to the next slide and explain what that is. So for those who don't necessarily have our regulation shorthand for criteria memorized, the B10 criteria is the newly introduced EHI export criterion. So the requirement is that if you have a module, a certified health IT module, or your certified health IT module is part of a product which stores electronic health information, then you will have to be certified to this new B10 criteria that will allow the export of electronic health information in the two circumstances that you see there on the right, a single patient export, so that will support patient access to their information and portability of that information. And then the second case of being able to export an entire patient population's electronic health information, which would support transitioning between health IT systems. Those export files have to be electronic and in a computable format. And as part of the certification and ongoing compliance with this criteria, a developer has to make a publicly accessible hyperlink of the format that are included as part of those export files so that they can be fully utilized. The intention here, obviously, Congress wanted to make sure that it gave providers and patients access to the data within health IT and ensured the interoperability of that data. So that is outside of the normal and expected assurances, that is probably the largest portion of what you will see within that assurances certification criteria. The maintenance of the criteria for assurances is primarily around some issues with record keeping and, of course, continuing to provide for electronic health information export. Next slide. I'm going to turn things over at this point in time to Mike Lipinski to talk a little bit about the communications criteria.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be back speaking with you all again about the final rule, although I think it will be just for a short time today. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through the communications condition of certification and the associated maintenance requirements. And I think in some respects this should be a refresher on the policy, which is now regulatory requirements, but I'm also going to try to highlight some of the changes we made comparative to the proposed rule. So while you stare at this screen, I think I'm going to try to level set a bit, which will help introduce the next few slides that we'll talk about. So as a reminder again, Congress focused on these six subject areas that you see on your screen, which we described in the proposed rule, and provide in certain instances some clarification in this final rule. So for clarity, developers are only not permitted from restricting communications regarding these areas. And so I'm going to urge both, those on the phone listening, I'm going to urge both of those who are developers and their customers, and I emphasize both in terms, particularly customers, to become familiar with these six subject areas. And just to give you an example of why, when we talk about business practices, what are those, right? Well, we talk in the rule about how they're not, and this is, it's not limited to just this, but they include costs for any products or services that support the exchange of EHI through certified health IT, as well as timeframes and terms in which developers facilitate exchange. And I guess I will note that we did clarify in the final rule that obviously, while it does include costs, we're not regulating developers' prices nor their terms or timeframes through this condition of certification. And the other, second big thing, which was noted earlier, is this condition only applies to certified health IT and the associate. So that means it's communications are about the certified health IT as well. So there's two limiting factors when we're talking about what types of communications are prohibited or restricted. These six areas, and has to be related to the certified health IT. So what is a communication? We talked about it in the proposed rule in various respects, and we tried to tie that together in the final rule. So if you recall, in the proposed rule, we gave examples of various modalities and mediums in which a communication could be made, such as YouTube, on Twitter, so some social media, as well as a written communication. And so we also gave examples of types of, so not just the medium that it's on, but also types. And so we talked about obviously screenshots, right, as well as, again, written or verbal communications. So in the final rule, we kind of brought that all together and provided a clear definition of a communication, which is that it's any communication, irrespective of the form or medium. And these terms include visual communications, which is not just screenshots, but also video. And we'll talk a little bit more about video and the comments we got on that and why video can be important as a form of communication. So before we move on to the next three slides, I wanted, which are really about how we balanced what Congress asked us to do, which you see on the screen here, and then developers' interests and rights with these statutory requirements. And that's what we'll talk about on the next three slides. So we can move to the next slide now, and we'll talk about unqualified protections. Next slide, please. Oh, here we go. Okay, so what you see on the screen now is the unqualified categories of unqualified protection. So what do we mean by that? So the bottom line is, if it fits into one of these categories you see on the screen, the communication that is, then it can't be prohibited for any reason or restricted. So that means no matter who's making the communication or what the communication is. And hopefully this will become more apparent when I run through the next two slides, which focus on what are permitted prohibitions and restrictions by developer. And what I'll try to do is use some of those categories to illustrate the distinction between these unqualified protections for certain communications and then where we've provided the ability for developers to prohibit and restrict certain communications. And just to talk briefly about the ones you see on the screen there, we identified through the rulemaking that there were certain communications that we thought were so important for a lot of the reasons you see on the screen, that they are related to potential safety issues, cybersecurity threats. Obviously, with this rulemaking, an important thing is whether or not there is any information blocking occurring or any other unlawful practice. And why we identify, so obviously I think those things are pretty apparent as to why there's a heightened concern with making sure those communications aren't restricted. But we identified who they could be, who those communications had to be made to for them to remain in the category of unqualified protection. So we identified essentially agencies and entities that we thought were capable of addressing the concerns raised through the communications, as well as had processes and procedures in place to protect the information that's in that communication. Because we understand, based on our policies and the ones that have now been finalized, that these communications may include certain information of which a developer has a vested interest, for example, intellectual property. So if that is being communicated, we want to make sure in these particular instances that there are processes and procedures in place to protect those intellectual property rights and interests. And so in some of these instances, for example, the federal government has the trade secrets law in which we must comply with. Patient safety organizations have their own processes and procedures that they follow to protect the information that's provided to them. And the same is true in some respects from the certification bodies who contract actually directly with the developer, and we expect in those contracting that there will be protections for anything that developer feels would cause them harm if it was disclosed publicly. All right, having talked a lot about the unqualified protections, let's move into the next slide and talk about the permitted restrictions and prohibitions we provide for developers, where we feel that there's a need to balance the statute with the interests and rights of developers. So here you'll find we focus on either who is making the communication or what is included in the communication. So in the first one, it's obvious it's developers, employees, and contractors. One change we made comparative to the proposed rule here was that we specifically included in regulation text that self-developers, which is a unique type of developer under the certification program, cannot prohibit or restrict their own employees and contractors. And I think that's apparent as to why, because they're not selling the product to a different user who would not be covered by this provision. The non-user facing aspects piece, I think we got some comments about this, and I think there should be some clarity there. We had provided this clarity both in the proposed rule and the final rule, but anything like such a source code or behind the scenes, so to speak, that can't be disclosed to the general public, and these are things that can be prohibited and restricted. But I think this is a perfect opportunity, having talked about these two categories, to draw or illustrate the distinction between the unqualified protection. So if an employee wanted to disclose a safety matter to a TSO or the federal government, they could do so. They would fall under the unqualified protection. Or if they wanted to disclose something like a cybersecurity threat, and we're going to show it's because there's a flaw in the source code that's causing it, so that while that's a non-user facing aspect and they are an employee, they still would be able to make that disclosure as long as they were making it to the entities identified in the unqualified protection categories. So hopefully that helps. And same with IP. If there was IP, intellectual property, in the communication, it could be disclosed to one of the entities identified under unqualified protection, as long as it's on that subject matter as well. So there's always that dual requirement. It's got to be the subject matter and to one of the entities identified in the unqualified protection. All right, so let's move now and talk a little bit about the topic of which we received a lot of comments, which was intellectual property, particularly and not surprisingly from developers, right? We want to stay on the prior slide, if we can go back. Okay, I think we're going back. Okay, it's just things aren't moving as quickly today. I think a lot of folks on the using up the bandwidth today, I think, understandably. So what did we do here? We maintained the fair use policy, which essentially means that when you're talking about that one aspect of intellectual property, and we acknowledge there are various aspects of intellectual property, which can be, run the gamut from, just to give an examples of like patent, trademarks, copyright, and then even what's called trade secrets and other type of proprietary protections that may be provided at the state level. But just talking in the aspect of copyright, we maintained the fair use policy that we had initially proposed. However, we, as you can see here, revised it in some respects. And so it is, as you see on your screen, that is how you find it in reg text now. So while we are permitting developers to institute restrictions that they think are necessary to protect their legitimate intellectual property interests, there are two things when they do that. One, they can be no broader than necessary to accomplish that goal, and they also have to be consistent with the other permitted prohibitions and restrictions, such as two I've talked to you about, non-user facing aspects and developers and employees, but also with the one I'll talk to you about later, which is the screenshots and video. So that's the general piece. I had started with the fair use piece. The way you should look at the fair use provision is that while developers have this ability to restrict, as seen on the screen, they can't do it when it comes to something that would be reasonably constitute a fair use. So that is like essentially a carve out to their ability to protect their intellectual property interests. So let's move to the next slide, and talk about the two other categories under permitted prohibitions and restrictions. Before I jump into more of the hot button one, similar to the intellectual property one, which is obviously the screenshots and video, I just wanted to make a note about the pre-market testing and development, which we maintain in its same form. In the final rule, however, we did note that there's no time limit on the amount of testing and development phases for this condition. So just for that clarity, we did receive comments about that, and I thought it worth mentioning on this webinar. All right, let's turn to the topic du jour, which is screenshots and video, right? So there's a few things we did. Off the top, I'll note that we did remove the piece about a health IT developer being responsible for third-party IP, either having to try to obtain those third-party IP rights to be disclosed. What we've pretty much said is, as long as they're complying with this provision, they're not responsible for third-party IP. So users should take note of that. If there is any third-party IP in there, that if there is no right to disclose it, they need to be cognizant of that. What else have we done? Obviously, the big one is we've added video. And that's because video is a form of visual communication that can be of use where screenshots can't accomplish the goal. And we talk about this in the rule, in the preamble, and as you can see here on the screen, which is part of the regulation text, is we only permit the use of video when it's addressing temporal matters that cannot be communicated with a screenshot. So, or another form of communication. What are we talking about there? An example would be some type of latency issue, right? Where you're making an order through the user interface, and the time it's taking for that order to go through, you end up duplicating the order because of that. And so thus that creates a safety issue. And that can only maybe be illustrated through the use of video. The key pieces are also using either screenshots or video is there's limitation. And the limitation is on the amount of the screenshots or the video. So it needs the relevant number of screenshots or the relevant amount of video. And that means there shouldn't be more than is essentially necessary to convey whatever the concern is related to those 6 categories. So again, still it has to be in those 6 categories. So nothing should be conveyed outside of those 6 categories. And obviously, we maintain the other requirement, as you see on the screen, that they cannot alter the screenshots in video in any way except to annotate them or resize them as needed. The other piece, I think, one last piece I want to mention regarding all of this is that we try to make clear that, because there was concerns, I think, from developers about when would they be seen if they were trying to take steps to intimidate. And we make clear in the rule to intimidate in terms of intimidate in a way to prevent a communication from happening by a user, one of their customers. And we wanted to be clear that if they're the developers trying to exercise their legitimate intellectual property rights, that would not be considered intimidation, but even if it was to file a lawsuit. So if they felt that something was being disclosed in which they were allowed, if you go back to that prior screen, they were allowed to restrict under that provision them filing a lawsuit, or if the communication included information outside of the 6 protected areas, them filing a lawsuit would not be considered some form of intimidation under this communication. All right, let's move to the last slide and talk a little bit about the maintenance of certification requirements. There were 2 changes we made here. My screen's taking a little bit of time to move, so I'm going to give it a couple seconds. Next slide. Okay, it may be I'm not sure if it's my screen that's frozen.
Hi, everyone. Hold on just one moment. We are trying to fix this. There is a bit of a technical difficulty, which is, again, due to the large number of people that are currently on the system. So hold on. We will be right back. Again, apologies everyone. We are just trying to reload the system quickly and see if that will resolve this issue. We will be right back on as quickly as possible. Please do not leave us. We are just reloading the deck so we can get restarted.
Okay, great. Looks like we're back up and running. And so I'll close out this condition of certification by talking about the maintenance requirements. Maybe at a little faster speed. So two quick things about this. Initially, we said that you would have to notify, if you were a developer, customers essentially 6 months, and then annually thereafter. If you still had provisions in your contracts or agreements that contravened this communication condition of certification, including meaning that you would not enforce such provisions that contravened it. We tried to make this more clear and say, look, you have to do it one time in 2020, send out that notice, and then annually thereafter. The other, I think, bigger provision in terms of impact from a burden perspective, at least how we heard it from developers, was amending their contracts to remove such provisions. What we had proposed was that they needed to do it within a reasonable period of time and no later than 2 years. And what we ended up with in the final rule is that they can continue to notify their customers that they do have these provisions that contravene the communications condition of certification annually until they remove them. But we're not setting a time frame on which they need to remove them. What we're saying is when you next update, establish a new contract, renew it, amend it, when you go to do that, that's when we would expect you to remove any contract provisions that are in contravention of this condition of certification. So we think this will still achieve the policy goal because the notices are still going out to customers that they can enforce these provisions, but it also reduces the burden on behalf of developers. So when they're in there changing their contracts normally, they can go in and make these changes at that time. Okay, I think at this point we can move to the next slide, I believe. Okay, as this is coming up, I'm going to turn it over to Avinash Shanbhag, who is the Acting Executive Director of the Office of Technology. Avinash is going to run through the API conditions and maintenance of certification requirements. Avinash, over to you now.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join the webinar. As Mike mentioned, my name is Avinash Shanbhag, and I'll spend a few minutes providing details about the API condition of certification. First, to reiterate what was mentioned previously, the API conditions of certification only apply to developer practices associated with their certified API technology and do not generally apply to other software interfaces. And if you see on the right side, we've defined a few things in the regulations. Just for your information, the certified API technology are the capabilities of health IT that fulfill any of the API-focused certification criteria adopted in the rule. And the health IT developers that create the API technology, the certified API technology, we refer to them in this conditional certification as the certified API developer. At a high level, the API conditions of certification established in the final rule address the practices around use of APIs and the ecosystem in which the APIs will be deployed. These include requirements around publication of documentation for app developers to be able to use the APIs easily, These are the transparency conditions. We have the fees condition, in which we describe the requirements around which fees are allowed and which ones are prohibited. And the business requirements, including terms and conditions for use of API by app developers and provider organizations that have deployed these APIs. And we refer to them as the openness and pro-competitive conditions. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. As you see in this slide, the API conditions are meant to complement the technical capabilities specified for APIs in the final rule. And combined, they seek to minimize the special effort necessary to use API technology. Specifically, these API conditions for certification apply to the developer practices associated with the 3 previously finalized functional API criteria, which we had in our 2015 edition certification, and the new FHIR standards-based read-only API criteria that we have established in the current final rule. It is also worth mentioning worth noting here that the scope of the electronic health information pertaining to the API conditions of certification is limited to the data elements specified in the US CDI. Moving to the next slide, please. In this slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the highlights of the 3 conditions of certification. And again, I'll refer everybody on the webinar to go through the regulations to get more details on all the requirements for each of these conditions. So at a high level, the transparency condition provides specific requirements for API developers, the certified API developers, to publish all their business and technical documentation necessary so that the API can be necessary to use the API, and the requirement is to publish them through publicly accessible hyperlinks. In the fees condition, we have requirements that set criteria for allowable fees, guidelines for fees that health IT developers are permitted to charge, and to whom they can charge. There are 3 categories of fees that are permitted in the fees condition, and these are the fees that a certified API developer can charge, and also we clarify to whom they can charge. First, we have the development, deployment, and upgrade fees. These are the fees that a certified API developer can charge to their customers, which are the health organizations that obtain their product. Again, these are the fees, and we provide additional clarification around the conditions and the ways in which the fees have to be reasonable and have to be done in a non-discriminatory manner. Certified API developers are also allowed to recover any usage charges, so any API usage charges that they incur in case they host the API on behalf of the provider organizations. And finally, we have a value-added services fees that also is something that a certified API developer can charge to the users of API, the app developers. And again, we have requirements in the regulation that talk about where the value-added services can be charged. In general, those are things that are over and beyond what is necessary to efficiently and effectively use the API. And we provide in the preamble some examples such as app stores and other educational materials that go beyond what are required by app developers to be able to use APIs to be qualified under the value-added services. In general, any fees not permitted by this condition are prohibited from being imposed. And finally, the openness and pro-competitive condition establish business requirements to ensure that the APIs can be effectively used. Some of the requirements here include things such as granting of rights needed by customers, the health organizations, to be able to use the APIs most efficiently and in a non-discriminatory terms. Also, there are business requirements to ensure that the terms and conditions if they are changed or any changes made to the underlying API technology, there's enough information provided to the app developers, the API users, to be able to make sure that the usage of these APIs in production environments is has the least disruption as possible. With that, can we go to the next slide, please? So as was mentioned, and again, as other conditions also have a parallel maintenance of certification requirements, which are the ongoing requirements to be met by certified API developers with respect to their certified API technology. And here, we have finalized a set of requirements specifically for the new FHIR standards-based API. Again, these are the maintenance of certification requirements that you see on the screen are specific and are only to the required for the new standards-based API that we have finalized in the rule. And they go towards using the FHIR-based API. So the three requirements that are put forth, one is the authenticity verification. This is where an API developer, a certified API developer, is permitted to institute a process. So they are not required, but if they do institute a process to verify the authenticity of the app developer, they are allowed to institute a process as long as such process is objective and is same for all API users and is completed within 10 business days. I want to note that in the NPRM, we had initially proposed 5 days, and based on commenters' feedback, we have increased it to 10 business days. Again, for the FHIR-based API, going to the app registration requirement, a certified API developer must register and enable all applications for production use within 5 business days of completing its verification of API users' authenticity. And again, the amount of days for making this registration completed was changed based on commenters' feedback, based on the feedback we received during the NPRM. And finally, we also have the requirement that health IT developers, certified health IT developers, will be required to publish their patient-facing FHIR endpoints for all their customers so that those endpoints are easily accessible to all the app developers and API users. There are a couple of more timeline-oriented maintenance requirements around meeting the API conditions certification for existing APIs that are already part of the 2015 edition, and also timelines associated with the rollout of the new standards-based API. In general, these timelines are aligned with other conditions certification, and they'll be covered later in the presentation. Go to the next slide. With that, I will turn it over back to my colleague, Rob Anthony, to discuss the remaining conditions of certification. Rob?
Thanks, Avinash. I'm just going to pause for a moment to thank everybody for sticking with us and to emphasize that we are recording this webinar and it will be made available later for people. So not only will you be able to fast forward to your favorite presenter, but you will be able to skip over any technical difficulties that we've encountered. I'm going to present what I think is the other major concept that you will find within the conditions of certification, which is real-world testing. Congress, through the CURE, required health IT developers to successfully test the real-world use of their technology for interoperability in the types and settings of care in which technology was deployed. The objective here being to verify the extent to which health IT that is deployed in a production environment continues to demonstrate conformance with that full scope of the applicable certification criteria and within the specific workflows or system architecture or type of care settings that it is marketed to. So you will see at the top of the slide the condition of certification that we put successfully testing that real-world technology in that setting, and we put some specific parameters around what has to be the criteria that has to be tested to, for those of you, again, who don't necessarily speak our regulatory shorthand, these areas like 315B and the other letters refer to some specific areas of certification criteria. B, for example, encompasses a number of the functionalities within certified health IT. C1 through 3 are related to clinical quality measure functionality, so on and so forth. So there are some parameters around what should be tested and must be incorporated as part of the entire plan. I want to emphasize that this is not something that providers do. This is something that health IT developers do. They submit they do perform this real world testing, and they will submit testing plans and results to ONC and the ACBs. And that is what you will see in the bottom portion of this, in the maintenance of certification. So the way this is affected is that there will be a submission of a real world testing plan, and then follow up based on that plan, real world testing results. You will make those available, or a developer will make those available through a publicly available hyperlink. We are working right now to make that available, those hyperlinks, through the Certified Health IT Product List, the Chapel website. And you would submit a plan no later than December 15th of each calendar year. I want to emphasize that the plan is not necessarily per health IT module. It is per developer, per criteria, per marketed workflow or setting of care, but not necessarily per product. So it is possible, especially for developers who have a number of different certified health IT modules, to be able to combine this and address multiple modules with a smaller cohort of real-world testing plans. So you would go through and you would submit the plan December 15th of each year. We put some criteria around what has to be in those plans, testing methodologies, the care settings that are covered, what kind of standards are addressed within it, schedule of milestones, and so forth that you can take a look at within the regulation. And then you would follow up by submitting real-world testing results of those plans March 15th of each calendar year. But just to make it clear to folks, the way that this would work is you would submit December 15th, and then the results that would not be the March 15th of the following calendar year, but the calendar year beyond that. So you would effectively submit results 15 months later. There would be about a little over a year for you to collect results and compile those together. So for example, the first real world testing plans would be due by December 15th of 2020. And the first results for those plans would come through March 15th, 2022. Those of you who were following along with the notice of proposed rulemaking, we did propose in there a pilot year for real world testing. That was primarily because of what we had anticipated the timing being of the final rule, but because of when we have actually released the final rule, we did not finalize the pilot year. So everybody will be on this December 15th. We also had a slightly different version within the NPRM of people who are new developers versus existing certified health IT modules, but we have simplified that, and everything is on this December 15th, March 15th schedule. If in the real testing results, a developer uncovers any nonconformities during testing, you want to report those nonconformities to the ACB. That is required to do so within 30 days. And then there is usually a corrective action plan to address those nonconformities. Next slide. There are a number of other things that you will find within the real world testing section. They are indicative of things that will need to be included within the real world testing plan, and they primarily refer to a number of standards that need to be updated. Those need to be addressed within the real world testing plan. So for example, the US CDI, the US Core Data for Interoperability updates that are underpin a number of certified criteria, such as one transitions of care and so on. Those will have to be addressed within real world testing plans. Similar updates to the CCDA standard updates, and of course the electronic prescribing standard updates. The indication here is 24 months, but the 24 months is an indication within the regulation for when those standards not only need to be incorporated within certified health IT modules, but also need to be rolled out, made available to end users. It is entirely possible that the real world testing of these will not be incorporated into plans until the following December 15th for these. So it is possible that those might not turn up until 36 months for the test plan, but those are also included within those section and one of the things that will have to be addressed by plans. Next slide. And talking about standards, I think one of the other things to unpack within this real-world testing area is the introduction of this standards version advancement process. We introduced this notion of a version advancement process for standards in order to allow some better industry alignment for the way that standards progress while still being able to maintain accountability among health IT developers. Hopefully what this does is allow developers to move forward and be flexible with some of the newer updates that are mature and ready for adoption, but may not have yet made it into requirement by regulation. We indicated that there will be a public process by which standards are advanced. There will be an opportunity for the public to nominate some standards to be advanced. We will consider those, and ultimately the national coordinator will approve any of the versions of updates that can be used, which will effectively mean that for some of the certified criterion, there will be multiple standards from which a developer can choose. The standards version advancement process in real-world testing allows the developer to be able to move to that new standard, whether you're coming in as a new product or whether you're an existing product. And the way you will do that is you will provide notice to all of the end users of your product and to your ACB about your intent to update to the more advanced version of that standard. Clarify any expectations about how that's going to affect the certified health IT module, and then also let people know about the continued support for existing versions of the standard. And then through your real world testing plan, you would indicate your conformance with that new standard. Again, hopefully what this allows folks to do is move to some new standards that are available as they become available and not have to completely wait for a brand new, for example, edition of certified health IT. Next slide. So I'm bringing this plane in for a landing. We are coming towards the end of things, I promise. We will have a couple of more slides and we will be able to close out very shortly. The last condition of certification is attestation, and this is very simple. It is an attestation to compliance with all of the conditions of certification. The developer has to attest that they have met all of these. ONC has finalized a biannual submission, so twice a year there will be a 30-day open submission period. It will happen in April and October. You will see at the bottom here the first window will open April 1st of 2021, so it's actually for next year. And in that window, you will attest from the effective date of the rule all the way through March 31st of next year for meeting those compliance with the applicable conditions, maintenance of certification. Thereafter, it will happen every 6 months. So the next one, for example, after this would be October 1st of 2021. You would be attesting for the period of April 1st through September 30th. In the proposed rule, again, we also had a different schedule here where we had new folks, new developers doing this at the time of certification, but we have put everybody on the same schedule here. Again, attestation is simply attesting to what you have done here. Next slide. There is a process for ONC to oversee the compliance with conditions and maintenance of certification. For most health IT developers, this will be pretty familiar. We have indicated that we're going to use the existing direct review process that we already use. I think the important point here is knowing that ONC is doing the oversight on condition certification. And we will utilize that direct review process. We may request some additional information from the health IT developer, some additional documentation. If we find a nonconformity, it generally results in a corrective action plan. If a developer does not adhere to the corrective action plan and bring a module into compliance, it could result in a certification ban or termination. But again, that is an existing process that I think most people are familiar with at this point. Next slide. And then finally, even though this looks like a great deal to unpack, this is just a snapshot of what conditions of certification will look like over the next several years. So a number of things that sort of happen in the first 60 days after publication. That is the effective date of the rule, where you have certain cures, certification criteria that will be removed or no longer enforced. There are certain prohibitions regarding communications. At the 6-month mark, there are requirements for the information blocking rules, and then for some compliance for some of the other conditions of certification, documentation for APIs, assurances, and so forth. The end of the year, 12/15, is the deadline for the first real-world testing plans that come due. And of course, the results for those plans would be submitted not in March 15th of 2021, but March 15th of 2022. I think the next really big deadline you will see as you look a little further out is at 24 months. That is where compliance with most of the other new and revised certification criteria that are within the final rule are required. There are things related, of course, to the standard for API and upgrading that. And then finally, at the 36-month mark from the publication date, there's the requirement that if your certified health IT module stores EHI, that you would be certified and you have rolled out the B10 EHI export certification capability. So that is a very high-level snapshot of what I think are probably the major milestones related to certification and conditions of certification over the next 3 or so years. So that is our entire presentation on conditions and maintenance of certification. Thank you very much. For those of you who have not heard me announce it, I will announce it one last time. We have recorded and we will be posting it and making it available to folks. And I thank you all for taking time to participate.